what do we need to get better at, know more about, be more aware about. And so thanks to our lovely president, Tamara Thorpe, and the entire board of SIETAR Europa, who are all very much behind it, we started this. My name is Bastian Künzel. I'm currently serving as vice president of SIETAR Europa. We have also with us Agnieszka Kotuc, who is running the tech side of things, and she'll in a moment talk a little bit about what everybody needs to know and be aware about when it comes to that. And most importantly, we have Susan Holm with us today. I will maybe introduce Susan after Agnieszka informed us all about the amazing technology we get to be working with, and that will make it all a lot easier for us to go through this. Agnieszka?
Thank you. So guys, welcome very much. And so a few things that are recently very important in terms of attending webinars. First of all, you have two options of participating in this meeting. One is chat, and the second one is question and answers option. Important regarding the chat. When you're writing in the chat, make sure that on your blue little tag is written all panelists and attendees. So then you make sure you address everybody. If you want to get some technical assistance, something is not working correctly, you can also use a raise hand option, and I will write you directly and try to help you with any of your issues. And so use chat for comments, for saying hellos, etc., etc. And you have also a Q&A option available. So if you have any questions, make sure to post it there, because when there is a lot of comments, we can skip some questions due to, you know, the speed of how the things are appearing. So when you do it in a Q&A, then we make sure that the question is posted and that you get your answers. So either questions for questions, Q&A window, or chat, but just make sure within the chat that you use all panelists and attendees option so that you share with all of us. So that would be two most important technical issues. Again, if you have any other, raise hand, I will contact you. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, we will have at the end a question and answer session. I'll be constantly monitoring the Q&A section, as will be Agnieszka, and we will try to note down all the questions there, and then I will ask them to Sue, and Sue will answer them for all of us. So now I get to introduce Sue, which is a big joy for me. Sue is an American, Canadian, German person. She lives in Cologne already in Germany for 28 years, and she's doing a lot of really interesting things. Some of the things that really astonished me, that as her main job, or as one part of her job, she is training policemen, police officers in Germany in order to wander the streets and take care of the community with a little bit more intercultural competence than they would without her intervention. She's also been volunteering last year, 2008. It feels like last year. 2020 doesn't really count anymore. So just in the recent past, she volunteered in Moria, the refugee camp on Lesbos in Greece, that was just recently really big in the news as well, because it was on fire and it caused a huge humanitarian crisis. But if she's not doing these things, she loves to be outdoors. She loves architecture, particularly the Bauhaus kind of style of it. And I've had a chance to quickly talk to her before we met here today. And I'm really, really excited about today's webinar, because I think it's a really important topic and a really insightful person to present it. So Sue, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bastian, for your kind introduction, and Agnieszka for your technical support. And I want to thank the board and Tamara for inviting me to share. Speaking of architecture, what I failed to mention to you, Bastian, is that my husband and I live in Cologne in an apartment that is a part of a complex that used to be an above ground World War II bunker. So it's quite an interesting building site that we live in. Yeah. Okay, to get started, I'm going to start out with some of the slides and as an introduction for today that were a part of my presentation last year at the Congress in Leuven. And there I was looking at broad cultural identity, saying that should we be taking another look at it? And so this is kind of a sequel to that, yeah. But like I said, as the introduction, I'm going to first look at some of those slides with you. I'm going to make us small somehow. There we go. So this was my first slide last year at that presentation. I started that seminar with this slide. Why take another look at broad culture description? I looked at the political rhetoric that was currently taking place in Germany to point out that both the lack of acknowledging broad culture on the one hand, combined with uninformed and biased description of broad culture, on the other hand, was fueling the climate of polarization. So what do the experts say? The experts say cultures don't meet, individuals do. I was talking then, as I am now, to my colleagues in SIETAR. It has such a nice ring, doesn't it? I say, let's put it on a t-shirt and wear it. But is it really a constructive help? Why do we, the experts, focus on individualization? By the way, I am someone who identifies as an individualist. This is where I feel comfortable. And I think that's okay, that's just fine. Many of us, I believe, within this field of interculturalists have multicultural identities. So we're kind of strange, or we're unique, as I do. I was born in Germany, started out my schooling in Germany, did another 7 years of schooling in the United States, and I graduated from high school in Canada. Many of us experienced our primary and secondary socialization in cultures characterized by individualization. And all of those three cultures that I grew up in are characterized by individualization. We are confirming our cultural identity. Reasonably, we react to group infringement on our identity, especially broad culture. The rejection of broad cultural description by European practitioners could actually be interpreted as a confirmation of the very descriptors that we are rejecting. It stands to reason that those of us who have been socialized in an individualistic culture would squirm in the face of group identification or broad culture. Don't put me in a box with other people. However, a recognition of broad cultural description in no way minimizes the supremacy of the individual. The powerful influence of cultural groups in the process of primary socialization cannot be denied. And yet, the integrity of the individual is not deflated by this process. It remains intact. Is it time to let go of broad cultural angst? By rejecting broad culture description, we are in danger of promoting a concept of diversity that is narrow and self-serving. We may just be promoting our culture. And so, by the way, when I refer to broad culture, just so you know what I'm talking about, traditionally, I'm referring to these men or these institutions or these studies or areas of research. Yeah, most of them are men. That's a good one right there. What might be the problem when we overemphasize focusing on individualization. So, number one, focusing on individualization ignores a large part of the healthy primary socialization process, which takes place in group interaction. Again, this does not infringe on the integrity of the individual. And here I also want to say that I do not acknowledge oppressive regimes, whether they are religious or political, as culture, but as oppressive systems. I define culture as a from the bottom up organic social construct, as opposed to a system that is from the top down. Focusing on individualization, number two, seems to ignore the basic human need to belong, a basic need for group affiliation. Rejecting the stabilizing factor of healthy broad group affiliation, and psychologists have given this need a name. They call it belongingness. Focusing on individualization ignores day-to-day phenomena. Yes, individuals meet, converse, and interact. However, individuals are not cultural vacuums. Culture requires a carrier, a home. Culture is at home in the individual. We carry culture with us everywhere we go and into every encounter with other individuals. Now, in the current globalized world, hybrid, expanded, or multicultural identity are becoming more prevalent. And by the way, I refer to myself as having an expanded cultural identity. I won't explain that now. If you want to know why that is, you can ask me about that. With this in mind, it should be noted that it is interaction with new cultures at a group level, that generates expanded cultural identity and not on an individual level. The big picture challenge. Robin DiAngelo is a researcher, an academic researcher, and an educator and an author. And she is working in the fields of critical discourse analysis and whiteness studies. She says, setting aside your sense of uniqueness is a critical skill that will allow you to see the big picture of the society in which we live. Individualism will not. So, what might I be missing by not setting aside my uniqueness and looking at the big picture? Focusing on individualization denies the platform or context in which discrimination, racism takes place. Of course, we reject race as a biological fact, but it definitely exists as a social construct. And focusing on individualization may actually support broad scale or systemic discrimination by an unwillingness to recognize broad culture descriptors or categories. Now, this was one of the last slides in my presentation last year. And at that time, I was becoming more and more uncomfortable with a refusal to recognize the concept of race in Germany, coupled with an insistency on colorblindness. And so now we are 1 year on, and I've left this slide blank. It's hard to know how to fill it right now. None of us could have imagined the global situation we find ourselves in due to the coronavirus. It is truly unprecedented. It has been amazing to watch experts in so many fields scrambling as they grapple with the situation. It has created context of study that would have been unimaginable if they had to be artificially created with human consent, which is often the case, in research studies. And for instance, take the environment. I can't imagine if researchers had asked everybody in the major cities of the world for 2 months or 3 months, if 50% of the people would stop driving their cars and stop flying and stop taking public transportation, just so we could just see what that might do to the air quality. obviously that would have never happened. But during the lockdown with the coronavirus, this is something that environmentalists were actually able to look at. And obviously, there have been major studies going on within the field of medicine, but not only there, also in economics and many other areas. But this situation has also bubbled up hidden issues to the surface so that they are now visible. The disadvantaged and marginalized become even more so in a crisis. This is one of those hidden in your situations underneath the surface that has been made visible by the coronavirus pandemic. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then in the midst of the lockdown, a Black man was brutally murdered by police in the US, which pushed many people over the edge of tolerance, silence, over the edge of complicity in regard to racism, creating a groundswell of protest in the US and also here in Europe. On Saturday, the 6th of June, there was a very large protest here in Cologne, and this photo of protesters appeared in the Cologne paper the following Monday. This Black woman is underscoring the importance of recognizing color, and in so doing, recognizing race as a social construct. Her sign says, "See the oppression, see the struggle, see my color." One could add to her sign, "If you don't see my color, you will not see the oppression and the struggle." Now, in the last few years, I have come to realize that acknowledging Black and brown or people of color is just one side of racism. The other side is in recognizing white, my skin color, or in recognizing whiteness. I spend most of my time looking at cultural self-awareness when teaching a course on intercultural competence. I have come up with this formula, which I call the Intercultural Global Positioning System, or Intercultural GPS. None of us could navigate these days without our GPS help. Well, I'm speaking for myself at least, but I'm thinking most of us use a GPS to navigate. When we use a GPS system, the first step that is required is for us to establish our starting point. Most systems these days enter our starting point automatically, so we forget about that, don't we? If you don't have location services activated on your device, you will have to enter it manually. And this is also true with regard to intercultural awareness competency. It starts with cultural self-awareness, and this is really, really vital. I need to spend a lot of time getting to know and understanding and being comfortable with my own cultural identity before I look at another culture and say, oh, I'd like to interact with that culture. I'd like to understand that culture. And therefore, I want to go about learning how to do that, which is the journey that I take then to that intercultural competency, that intercultural awareness. Now, mind you, when we're taking a trip, let's say with the car, let's say I wanted to go from Cologne to Rome. It wouldn't do me a whole lot of good to pull out a very close-up map of Rome showing me all the little streets of Rome when my starting point is in Cologne. The first thing I would have to do is pull out a map that showed the streets of Cologne so I could figure out how to navigate out of Cologne. And then I'd have to pull it up quite big for it to show me Germany. And then I would have to figure out how to navigate my way south through Germany. Now, once I got into Italy and got closer to Rome, I could start pulling up a much more uh, smaller map or specific map of the area around Rome and then of Rome itself. Um, I believe that this also holds true in our desire, our want, or our need to become interculturally competent and aware when it comes to other cultures. Beyond that, I have come to realize that cultural self-awareness leads to cultural humility. And by that, I don't mean a belittling of my culture or a shaming of my culture, not at all. What I mean is to become fully aware of my cultural identity and to become comfortable with it, actually, so that I can actually hold it loosely in my hand and make room for other cultural awareness, so that I make space for that without constantly having to defend my own cultural identity or my own cultural position. I think that when we make room, that kind of room, through cultural humility, we create the space or the path towards cultural sensitivity. And I also think that's really important. So what does that mean when looking at black and white? When looking at my starting point, which is whiteness. Historically speaking, there are only two racial groups of color, and those groups are not white and black, but rather white and non-white. White was seen as the norm or standard for humans, and everything else, non-white, as a substandard or faulty deviation. Now, this concept of race, which is still held on to not biologically today, but socially as a construct, was developed here in Europe several hundred years ago. This is where that concept was developed. And it was spread. It spread through not just to North America, for instance, to the United States, but globally, because it was developed during the period of colonialization. And the European countries basically colonialized most of the world. All of Africa, most of North and South America, huge parts of Asia. And so this idea is really a global construct and not one that we can point a finger at to the United States and say, oh yeah, it's just about them. That's really not the case. I'm not going to say anything more about the history of that because I think, trying to think of the next webinars that Matthew Hill, I think I got the name right. He's going to be going much more into the history of that, which is really, really interesting. And so I urge you to attend that seminar. That's just in 2 weeks' time, I believe, on the 7th of November. So when looking at race and racism today, we are looking at prejudice and discrimination directed at those who are non-white, which results in inherent, that is, socially and structurally, not biologically, but inherent human devaluation, disempowerment, and perpetual disadvantage. When looking at whiteness, we are looking at inherent, socially and structurally, status and empowerment granted to those deemed to be white, which results in white privilege. And here I also want to note that these categories of white and non-white, or white and black, are very subjective. These are extremely, extremely subjective categories. But this is my cultural GPS starting point when looking at black and white. Although her book received criticism, this was my biggest takeaway from Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. The biggest takeaway is that I am white and being confronted with my whiteness. But I will also say more about that, as I've said, as I go along. If we refuse to accept race as a social construct, we are living in denial because we are all, to some extent, racialized during our primary socialization. This reminds me of Milton Bennett's DMIS, and I think many of you know who I'm talking about when I refer to him. He's also a member of SIETAR. And the DMIS has these two sides, ethnocentrism and ethnorelativism. It's a graduating scale from one side, from the left side to the right. And on the left side, the scales, the stages are denial, defense, and minimization. But I guess maybe it's a kind of reverse denial in that I clearly see broad groups of people who I could describe as people of color or non-white, but do not see myself as belonging to the broad group white. I may accuse people of color as pulling out the subjective race or racism card when talking to me about the discrimination they experience here in Europe. But when I answer, I see myself as being in a colorless, objective construct. This is denial. I am answering out of a white, subjective construct. Further, if we insist on colorblindness, on the other hand, we cannot deal with racism because we are denying the construct in which it takes place, which I have already said. Colorblindness is a minimalization of difference between white and black. Colorblindness sounds so nice, doesn't it? Just like cultures don't meet, individuals do. It makes you want to lock arms and sing, "We are the world, we are the children." Yeah, but it is a denial of the proverbial elephant in the room, that those who are non-white experience life very differently than those who are white. We can quickly point out those who are overt racist, in denial or defense, as they call out their racial slurs and hateful speech and violent actions, while at the same time not recognizing that we are also supporting systemic racism by rejecting a notion of color. Race and color have been taboo topics for interculturalists like us. However, if we want to see discrimination, we must be willing to look at taboo topics. And so I'm going to look at 6 more. In fact, if we want to look at injustice, you have to be willing to become uncomfortable. So please bear with me. These 7 contexts can and do provide space for disparity in power dynamics. Additionally, we can see intersectionality among these 7 points. In the construct of race and color, there has been and still is a huge power disparity in favor of white, not just in the US, but also in Europe and globally. And so looking at race or color and seeing them as broad constructs should lead me to cultural humility. But let's look at the next one. Lesson number 2, religion. Oh my. I can almost see the looks of unbelief on your faces. No pun intended. Religion is definitely a taboo topic in Germany. Many of the refugees in Germany are Muslim. Like Christians, some are devout, others are nominal, and others quite secular, but Muslim in culture. When teaching intercultural competence, I point out that culture has a much stronger influence on societies than religion does. Although global regions may share a common religion, like the Arabic region or Europe, the countries within those regions have very different cultures. And that's why I maintain that culture is stronger than religion. However, it is my experience that even if we don't want to talk about religion, it is an area of great significance for many people, and I am one of those people. I call myself a Christian or a Christ follower. So, and I say that to make 2 points, actually 2 very contradicting points. And the first one I want to make is in light of diversity. And this is that first point. We need to be respectful for those who choose to be religious without looking down on them. And like I say, I think this is a matter of diversity. My second point is this. For those of you who are religious, regardless of what faith community you belong to, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, etc., please interpret your holy writings, your teachings, your sayings, your stories to treat all people with equal value, with equal dignity, with equal worth and respect, as your brothers, your sisters, your mothers, your fathers, your children. Now, I certainly acknowledge that religious institutions and religion have been co-opted or have been used, taken over, to do just the opposite, to inflict unthinkable policies and actions of oppression and dehumanization. And this cannot be tolerated. Some of you may be thinking, exactly, religion is the source of the problem. It is a source, but not the only one. One of the most oppressive and closed societies in the world today is North Korea, for example. And this is not due to religious ideology, but to political ideology. Oh, and I just read in the paper today, they're getting ready to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Workers' Party, I believe on the 10th of October. Looking at religion should lead us to theological humility. Like I said, be careful how you interpret your religion. So for those of us who are still, those of you who are still rolling your eyes over the topic of religion, let's move on to the next topic, ethics. So you may not be religious, but I certainly hope you have some kind of moral standard or guide. When I start to teach the module on discrimination and racism, my police students sigh and roll their eyes, and they say, hey, we're the good guys, we're the good ones. We're not racist. To which I respond that I don't doubt their good moral intentions. I certainly hope as future police officers that they have good moral intentions. But racism is something that needs to be removed from a good-bad binary or a good-bad scale. As in, racists are bad people or bad people are racists and good people are not racist. In fact, I tell them that humankind tends towards racism, to which they generally act extremely offended. There are a number of approaches one could use to make this point, actually. One of my students just this year, just a few months ago, in his bachelor thesis, addressed racism within the police. And he named 5 different theories for the possible cause of racism, including theories out of ethnopsychology, critical psychology, and social biology. It was a quite fascinating reading assignment for me. The social biology theory is one that I would simply label as coming out of anthropology and reminded me of another one of our esteemed colleagues, Patrick Smith, in this organization of ours. And he's written a great little book called In Search of Intercultural Understanding. In that book, he says, intercultural sensitivity is not natural. By nature, we seek similarity, people like ourselves. It's a natural product of our tribal instinct, part of our primate past. Now, in this age of globalization, we are suddenly told that our unconscious natural habits of protecting our tribe and living in splendid isolation have become dysfunctional. We are expected to live and work in harmony with other groups. To say that most of us haven't been prepared is more than an understatement, and it mirrors the difficulty of overcoming our ethnocentric instinct. This is an argument or a look at what could be our struggle with racism from an anthropological perspective. Looking at ethics should lead us to moral humility. There is a Black pastor in Germany with whom I'm acquainted and I admire. Now, after the George Floyd murder, he sent out a newsletter in which he said he was telling bishops in the United States that racism is not a skin problem, it is a sin problem. Now, as someone who believes in the depravity of man, I tend to agree with his theology, but by downplaying skin or color, he is avoiding, in my opinion, moral responsibility. On the other hand, many of my interculturalist colleagues, who I admire and respect, are insisting on colorblindness as a leap forward into a social utopian world, which I also long for. I really long for that. But this is a denial of the world we live in right now. And this is also an avoidance of moral responsibility. Both are a kind of polarization that deny the very real constructs of color in which our daily lives take place. To assert that we will be able to deconstruct these constructs from the outside is to speak from a utopian moral high ground in which I exclude myself as being part of the imperfect and broken constructs that the rest of the world is living in. Friends, I think we need to let go of moral perfection, not to have an excuse for our moral failure, but as an admonition for regular self-reflection and an openness to correction and an openness to corrective action. When I started this journey at a conscious awareness level 7 years ago, so this was a long time, I guess relatively speaking, a long time before I read the book, White Fragility, the first thing I was confronted with was my own inner posture regarding race and color. That was shocking because I didn't think of myself as a racist. This was very uncomfortable for me and made me sad, but it has enabled me to move beyond that point, allowing for correction and moving me onto a path which can take me to a better place. This is a journey, it is not an arrival. And I believe that about intercultural competence too. You don't all of a sudden arrive at this point and now you are competent. I believe it is a lifelong journey, but I do think that it is full of hope. It has given me hope. Humility lesson number 4, education. When there was this huge influx of refugees into Germany in 2015, 2016, there were a bunch of us here in this part of Cologne, it's called Nippes, who decided we had to do something to help because the infrastructure just wasn't there. The social services and the foreign office and everybody, they were just scrambling to try and figure out how to deal with it. So by early 2016, a number of volunteers we had organized, and we decided we were going to offer German classes, pre-beginner German classes for Germans. And because like I said, at that point in time, they didn't have the classes available for number of people who were coming into Germany. And this was a great group of volunteers. There were a number of retired school teachers. There was an architect, there was an engineer, a manager high up in personnel and in a major organization here in Cologne. And we got together and we pulled this off, and it was just a great experience. There were a lot of refugees who came because there was a refugee center or shelter that was right here where we all live, and it was just a great time for all of us. But after a few months of doing this, I and another of the volunteers noticed also that we had a tendency to want to treat them like children, although we were working with adults. And so we stopped and we talked about that as volunteers, and we thought, you know, what's that about? They're adults, they're not children. And obviously one of the first answers to that, I think, is simply language. When you can't speak the language, or your language ability is really elementary, you sound like a child, and people tend to talk back to you as if you are a child. That was one of the problems, and we had to sit back and think about that. Another issue was that a lot of them actually were not educated, had no formal education or very little. And this was especially true if they were coming out of Afghanistan, or even if they came out of Iran but were Afghani. Not necessarily true for refugees coming out of Iran who were Iranian, or out of Syria, for instance. And we had to sit and think, okay, do we see them as being less intelligent because they have never had any formal education? And that was a danger, thinking that there was somehow a difference in our levels of intelligence because they were uneducated. And then another thing we realized we were also doing was in our exuberance, our zeal to help them, is we wanted to make decisions for them, decisions that really they had the power to make. But we wanted to say, no, this is what you have to do. This is what you should do. And realize that we needed to back off on that and let them make decisions. The decisions they could make, a lot of them they couldn't make. But those they could make, they should be able to make, and we shouldn't be the ones who should be telling them what to do. And I think I can rightly say that most of us, all of us in this group, are highly educated. So there is also another aspect that I would like to point out regarding education, and that is that science doesn't always get it right. Jürgen Habermas, the famous German philosopher who is living but quite elderly, was interviewed by the Cologne paper in early April regarding the pandemic. The headline of the article was a quote from that interview, and this is what it said. "We've never had so much knowledge about what we don't know." Now, when I first saw it, it made me laugh out loud. As we see the pandemic unfold, it has been interesting to watch the scientific world scramble. At the beginning, it was all about physical contact and washing your hands and don't shake hands and don't hug people and wear gloves. And then suddenly the experts discovered that the biggest danger was in the air. So now we are wearing masks. I've been amazed at the speed with which scientists are working on optimizing the treatment of those who contracted the virus and on a vaccine. And they have really made huge advances in how they've treated people with the virus from when they were first working on that. And I know the doctors in Germany were in contact with doctors in China and said, what did you do? And then they were watching and listening to the doctors in Italy as they dealt with it in such a massive way before it really became that problematic here in Germany. Yeah. But the speed of this, it feels like a film that is being played in fast forward, but it's in real time. Research that normally takes decades is being done in a matter of months. And I have to say, I am so grateful for these experts, these scientists, these doctors, and all that they're doing. And yet, I think I could say we are also hoping that they don't make a mistake. Here in Europe, science jumped onto this bandwagon, this idea of race in the 1800s with the theory of social Darwinism. I'm not going to explain that now. I'm hoping that maybe that will be done in the next webinar. If you're not familiar with social Darwinism, please look it up and become familiar with it. It was used to justify the oppressions going on during colonialization and since then, during the Nazi era, during other eras of oppression. So with hindsight, oh, by the way, it carries the name Darwinism, but really has nothing to do with Darwin. But this is the name that was given. With hindsight, we know now that this was bad science, and yet its appalling effects are still a part of our social constructs today because we haven't actively deconstructed this notion. And when I bring this up in my racism and module, discrimination module with my students, none of them know what it's about. They haven't learned it. They didn't learn it in the school system. They don't know what social Darwinism is. We all, I think, including me, have dearly beloved theories and training ideologies and methodologies. We need to be careful about holding them too closely and thereby preventing a critical look or reflection on them. I'm sure many of you have already had critical thoughts of concepts I have referred to, like broad culture, for instance, and some of the experts I have quoted, and that's okay. I think you're right to be critical. That's all right. Looking at education should lead us to intellectual humility. Humility lesson number 5, democracy. Every year, I take my students class by class to a museum here in Cologne, and that museum is called the L. Day House. On the outside, it's very insignificant, but this museum or this building is a very significant site because it was the headquarters of the Gestapo, or the secret police, during the Nazi era in Cologne. More than Cologne, it was a large region extending all the way to the borders of Belgium and the Netherlands. So it's a museum that talks about, that illustrates, demonstrates the rise of the social, the Nazi era, and which is very, very interesting because it's local. They talk about what happened in Cologne instead of being kind of general and talking about all of Germany. That makes it very interesting. It is also a place for research. They do ongoing research about that and about racism and discrimination today, currently. But in the basement of that building, it's actually a memorial site, because there you find the cells that the prisoners who had been arrested by the secret police, the cells that they were kept in, that they were interred in. And what's really interesting about those cells is that they have been largely maintained in their original state. And so the walls are just covered in inscriptions that the people who were held captive there had written on the walls. And it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. If you're ever in Cologne, you really should go see it. The stories are so interesting, including the documentation that they have managed to put together there at this museum. So we take a tour, 1 hour tour, and then I always reserve a room there, and we sit down to discuss and reflect on what we've experienced, what we've heard, the emotions we've had, and you know, it's this is not a fun ride when we go on this field trip. It's sobering. It's tough to be confronted as a German with the atrocities of that era. And but I point out to them, I say, now, obviously, you here, sitting here, or me as well, we don't carry personal responsibility because we were not a part of that era. We were born afterwards. But I say it's still really tough, isn't it? And point out that the one reason it's so tough is that enough time just hasn't elapsed. As far as the people who lived in that era and either witnessed, carried out, or were the recipients, the sufferers under the atrocities, that is only one I'm only removed by one generation. It would be my parents, and my students, it would be their grandparents. And so because of that close proximity, it feels personal somehow, which makes it tough. And often the response is from my students, you know, some of them will say, well, you know what? If this ever happens again here in Germany, I'm going to speak out and say something. I am not going to be quiet. And obviously, this is a response that you want, that you're hoping for, and very welcome. Some students are offended because they've been reminded of this time in Germany. And then they and others like to point out that, you know, we were defeated, and Germany today is a different Germany, and they are right about that. And we have this constitution, this amazing, awesome constitution, and it is good and amazing. And then they say, so, you know, that's in the past, they say. They say, we have learned that lesson. Now, I'm going to say to you what I then say to them when they come up with that response. I say that no lesson is learned once and for all. If that were so, we would not see history repeat itself, as is often the case. In fact, holding on to this idea, we have learned that lesson, puts us in danger of repeating history. Every generation needs to be awake, needs to be vigilant and looking to see if the ideals we believe in are actually being carried out and are evident in the society around us. Democracy is one of those precious things that can be used for justice and well-being, or for horrific acts of violence and dehumanization. We just need to start with our current events and look back in time a few hundred years to see that. It is not an end-all in and of itself. It is not the cure to all diseases or the ultimate removal of injustice. It is no better or worse than those who are wielding its power. So that in this sense, we can also remove it from a good-bad binary scale. If we want to generate the good that we desire, it will have to constantly be monitored and adjusted in order to keep it in line, in order to keep it on course. This course is not self-prescribed by democracy. It will take constant human intervention and correction. This takes work and means that we can't sit back and be comfortable with the status quo. The Internal Affairs Minister of Germany, Horst Seehofer, has repeatedly refused to allow racism studies to be carried out with the argument that there is no institutional racism in the police force or the whole German society as a whole because it is forbidden by the German Constitution. Now, we obviously understand this to be a ridiculous argument. The Constitution is good and wonderful. It is really good and wonderful. And I've put up here the very first sentence in the Constitution of Germany. It's called the Grundrecht, the Grundgesetz. I've left this, I don't know why, I left it in the German language, I guess in honor of the German language, in honor of this country. And this first sentence is so beautiful. And I would say that many people, if you stop them on the streets here in Germany and you said, what is the first sentence in the Constitution of Germany? They would spout it out. They would say, Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar, or human dignity is inviolable. It is never to be broken, never to be infringed upon or dishonored. That is such a wonderful statement. It almost makes me emotional. And then the whole first section is called the Grundrecht, or basic rights. And it all has to do about human rights. And that first statement, as I said, is the first sentence in Article 1. And Article 3 talks about the fact that men and women are equal before the law. My students often make the mistake. I say, what does the Constitution say about men and women? They say it says men and women are the same. I say, no, it doesn't say that. It says that they're equal before the law. And then the third article, talks about not being, no one is allowed to discriminate against someone because of their gender, or their ethnicity, or their race, or their language, or their belief, or their religion, or their political beliefs, etc. And the word race is in there, and since the George Floyd murder, well-meaning intentions people have been saying, we have to take race out, and I'm thinking, no, don't do that. It's the same argument, the color blindness thing. If it's not in there, then it doesn't exist. Well, that's a little ridiculous. It does exist structurally, and so it does need to stay in the Constitution. But anyways, the Constitution of Germany is beautiful and good. But again, I want to emphasize that it is no better than those who are implementing or upholding it. Also, the purpose of undertaking a study to reveal possible systemic racism in the police should not be to vilify the police, so that we could say, oh, those awful police, but to take corrective measures so that we can, with good conscience, say, look, we're on track. We're taking proactive and preventive measures with regard to systemic racism. Additionally, I believe that racism at the systemic level will reveal itself in all of society's institutions and not just one, like the police force. Unfortunately, some of you will know this if you track the news in Germany. Unfortunately, just last week, the shocking news of right extremism, a network of right extremism within the police of this state, has been uncovered. And it was uncovered accidentally. They were investigating something completely else, not having to do with that. They are just beginning the investigation, so what is known is probably just the tip of the iceberg. But mind you, the Interior Secretary and also of the state, they're still saying, no, we don't want any kind of racism studies, you know, within the police or even within the society as a whole. We don't think that's necessary. Looking at democracy should lead us to political humility. 6, wealth. Okay, I realize that a lot of us might be squirming now. My main intention is not to look at personal wealth. Private wealth is an absolute taboo topic in Germany, whereas in the US, it is something that you can talk about. You can even flaunt it. On the other hand, politics is an open debate and a love debate of a topic for debate in Germany, whereas in the United States, it's more of a private subject. I seem to recall in one of the Scandinavian countries, it might be Finland, that everybody's yearly income is public and can be accessed. I think that would make me a little bit uncomfortable. So having said that, I would never call myself wealthy, and yet my guess is that most of us, as well-educated Westerners, have a level of wealth that puts us in a small percentile at the top when compared to the rest of the world. But my main concern is in the distribution of wealth, and I think it would be good to stay close to home in this sense and not look outside of North America or Europe. It is certainly clear that the US is in a sad state regarding wealth distribution, but studies show that the wealth gap continues to widen in wealthy countries in Europe also. This is another area where the pandemic has brought to light major inequity, as I said way at the beginning. And this is not just in the US, but also in Europe. The highest level of social care in Germany is called Hartz IV. The daycare and school-age children and the families who receive this level of social service, they receive various kinds of support, including free breakfast and lunch at school. When the lockdown started, these free meals were suddenly missing as a part of their daily diet, with the result that the parents now had to provide those meals, but they were not allocated the extra funds to do that. This is just one small example of where the disparity between those who are disadvantaged financially bubbled up during the corona lockdown. The same could be said for remote schooling. White middle-class Germans did a lot of complaining, and rightly so, about the quality of remote teaching. But of course, they at least had all the technical equipment and knowledge to participate, let alone entertain themselves with their tablets and computers. Marginalized families, who are often people of color, especially the refugees, for instance, but not only, tend to have only smartphones, which are not adequate for remote learning. This, of course, could be solved, but it would take the allocation of tax monies to do that. I hardly need to mention beyond that the hotspots of COVID-19 that broke out among guest workers working and living in totally unacceptable conditions here in Germany. And so, I would like to address what is for me one of the most alarming aspects regarding wealth. And that is the perpetuation of a class system. During the influx of nearly 1 million refugees into Germany in 2015 and 2016, many Germans became alarmed about job security. Now, unemployment was at an all-time low. And in the end, the job market was able to hold up to that influx. In fact, it went down even lower, proving that this alarm, this concern was unfounded. However, many politicians and economists from a variety of parties, not the far right, centrist parties, began pointing out how the influx into the job market is exactly what Germany needed. especially in nursing care for the elderly and in childcare. Both of these sectors are notoriously understaffed and underpaid. This was the justification. The jobs that white Germans are no longer willing to do because of pay and working conditions should, of course, be given to those who will say yes to those jobs because they are desperate for work. This is undeniably a kind of class ideology. Additionally, these jobs tend to be carried out by women. During the lockdown, women were the ones who, for the most part, had to carry out the extra burden of supervising their children's remote learning while trying to maintain their jobs as well. Or they were much more likely to be laid off and facing a drastic cut in income. Sure, maybe some of those who are in marginalized groups consider it a great joy to care for the elderly, but it is a racist notion to think that they should all be thankful for this opportunity, and those who do work in this sector should receive fair pay and humane working conditions. Now, I am so thankful for the social service system in Germany, but there is still room for improvement, especially regarding those who are marginalized, people of color, and for women. So looking at wealth should lead us to economic humility. Number 7, age. By the way, I'm coming down to number 7 here, so I'm almost finished. And I could have increased this list. For instance, you may have noticed that I'm not going to talk about gender or sexuality. And I realized that too after I made my list, and I thought my list is already long. So I'll leave that one off because that is one that is actually discussed quite often. Another one that I would love to discuss, but there won't be time, and that is the justice system. Looking at the prisons and who's the percentages of prisoners with immigrant background, etc. And I'm talking about Germany here, by the way, and not the United States. But let's look at age. At the age of 61, I am quickly becoming an old white woman. We do tend to become more fearful and resistant to change as we age. The thought that the ideologies that I hold very near and dear to me may not be so dear or even be full of fault is frightening to me. I must admit, as I have said, that individualism is quite dear to me. Since I have interacted and made a number of friends with refugees, I have had a close-up view of collectivism or societies where collectivism that are characterized by collectivism. And now I am quite fascinated by it. And I have come to accept that it is just as valid as my precious individualism. In fact, the two ideologies can complement each other in a beautiful way. My children are in their 30s. I have 2 sons. And although they are fiercely independent thinkers, they live much more collectively in their social lives. I have watched that and I admire it. They are showing me a different and maybe sometimes a better way. We need to listen to the younger generation and above all, make space for them in our work and also in this organization, SIETAR. Looking at age should lead us to generational humility. What is our starting point regarding race and color? Are we self-aware of color, especially those of us who are white? Do we understand that we see, that we make sense of, and we experience life out of a white context? If not, we will not be able to see the oppression of those who are non-white. I am hopeful. The lockdown in Germany started on March 13, and by March 19, I needed to be ready to go with online remote teaching. As teachers, we had zero support from the university where I teach. That has changed in the meantime. Now, I am technically challenged, but I resolved to make this work. I bought a Zoom account, played around with it, but I was full of anxiety the evening before my first online classes. To clear my head, I decided to take a long walk along the Rhine River, thinking the fresh air and the flow of the river would revitalize me, which it did. Cologne prides itself as a center for the arts in Germany, and as I walked, I came across this permanent light installation, which I had never seen before, and it lifted my spirits. As I have listened to Black and brown voices in the last weeks, though, I am not hearing much hope from them, folks. I just read another interview yesterday, and it was tough. It was tough with regard to hope from an interview by a Black person. History has not been kind, even after major events that have generated protest against racism. Change has been non-existent or so small that its effect is quickly played out. D'Angelo in her book talks about the process of women in Western countries receiving the right to vote and what it took for that to happen. All of the protest marches by women, and even men who marched with them, would have been to no avail, would have had no effect if those with the power to make a change had not decided to make that change. It required men to take action, to extend power sharing to and with women by giving them the right to vote. So it is time for us, folks, to become uncomfortable, to speak out, to become active for change. We who are white need to listen to what Black and brown bodies and voices are saying. We need to take them seriously and actively work for that change to happen. Thank you. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Sue. That was amazing. And there was a lot of positivity going on in the chat, so I'm very thankful for that. We have one question right now only that's in the official Q&A channel. So I'm going to start with that. Joe Kearns asked where in the world you would particularly see individual focused cultures.
A lot, Northern Western Europe, I would say, focus on individualism. The United States does. Canada does also. Southern Europe not. Yeah, to name some.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Joe, I hope that answers
we're
your
raised,
question.
you know, in our families, in these cultures, in the United States and in Germany, we are raised from the time we are born to be independent, to stand on our own 2 feet, to leave our parents' house and to be able to make it on our own. That is a classic characteristic of countries that emphasize individualization. And when I say that, I'm not being, I don't mean to be negative about that aspect, that is how we raise our children.
Oh, cool. There is a request to see again the slide showing the entire list of taboos that
yeah.
And one question here, Sue, we need to lift the lid on decoloniality concepts and decolonizing our minds big time, I feel, in the intercultural world. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, well, I would say I definitely agree with that, totally. This is something that I'm still trying to inform myself, educate myself, wrap my head around that. As I said, it isn't something that we had learned in the school system. I know my students haven't. They talk about the colonial period, but not in the sense of decolonializing. And we have an awful lot of work that we need to do there. I think it's really important.
One comment from Joe in relation to your explanation of way in the world you see individualist cultures is that most rural societies are community focused. So they're focused on also within geographies that there may be different orientations.
Yeah, sure. This is true, and you know, and when I talk about that, I did that with a really broad stroke. I will admit that. If you go into even all of these countries where I said, oh, here we see an emphasis on individualization. It may be true that in rural areas, that's the emphasis isn't as strong as it is in metropolitan areas.
One question that appeared in the chat is, what do you say to your kids about the Black Lives Matters movement in America?
What do I say to my kids? Actually, I ask them about it. Because I want them to talk to me about it. They're very much in support of it, and I really like listening to their take on it. Yeah.
And what do you learn from them?
I'm asking them to talk to me.
And what have you learned from them?
Yeah, that they're they're very supportive of it. In fact, both of my sons at this time live in the United States, and one of my sons took part in a protest that threatened to turn quite ugly, and was just their personal experience with it, and their conversations with others is interesting. I mean, we're getting into it's so politicized in the United States also, which isn't necessarily the case here in Europe. But one of the things that they have to face there is that if they say that they're supportive of it, then they're immediately put into a particular political camp, which is interesting. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Any other questions into the Q&A? Or hands up?
I'm more than happy to willing any questions that are out there. If we have 5 minutes yet, I'd like to say something about Moria, because I didn't talk about Moria at all.
Yes, please.
And because that's really quite a current topic at the moment. I was there two years ago in 2018, volunteered in the camp, and it was physically, emotionally, mentally one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I'll talk a little bit about what my experience when I was there. Most of the camp is run by volunteers, and so they're always asking for volunteers. The Greek government is involved in registering newcomers, and the Greek military in providing meals, which are minimal. The Greek police has a very low presence in the camp. The United Nations is there, but the only way they were involved, I guess I need to talk in the past tense since it actually no longer exists, but was in processing asylum claims. So everything was in low supply, or not even there. And it's a failure on so many levels. It's a collective failure as far as Greece, Germany, the EU, and the United Nations. And I know these countries and these organizations. I'm a fan of the United Nations, by the way. I love Germany. I love Greece. So this isn't, I don't have a vendetta here. But it is such a collective failure as to what has happened there. We would, when newcomers came in, there was no place to house them. And so most of them, for the first few nights or for months, simply slept on the ground or on the floor somewhere. And so then they would beg us for a piece of cardboard to sleep on so that they didn't have to lay directly on the ground. So they at least had a piece of cardboard between them and the ground. And there was, it was a space that was made to hold, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000 people, when there were over 10,000 people when we were there. And there was a large number on the hill called the Olive Grove, just outside of the camp, because there just wasn't space in the camp. And they just built makeshift huts out of scraps of wood and cardboard and tents that people had donated that we would hand out, and we didn't have any more tents anyways. But they were just like little camp, little two-man tents. And I remember one night, as I was at one station, a mother, I think it was either Iranian, I think it was an Afghani mother with 2 young children. She came to us, and there was going to be a big storm that night. And she came to us and she said, "I cannot take this. I cannot take it. If I have to spend one more night in that tent, it is so broken and it's not going to hold up. And I have 2 children. If I have to do that one more time," literally, folks, this is what she said to us. She said, "I'm going to commit suicide and kill my children." I'm not trying to be dramatic here, okay? And so we looked at each other, and we had nothing to give this woman, all right? We had duct tape. And so, another young German volunteer woman, we took our rolls of duct tape and we just walked with her to her tent. And we couldn't speak with her. The reason I know what she said was there was a translator at that point. And we went to her tent and we just duct taped and duct taped and duct taped and tried to put enough tape on it that hopefully it would hold together that night during the storm. Now let me fast forward to what just happened 2 weeks ago. So I look at these people after it's burnt down, and they're sleeping on the edges of the streets, on the ground. And I'm thinking, okay, it's really not a whole lot different than it was when they were in the camp, which is amazing when you think about it, all right? That tells you how desperate the situation was in the camp. And secondly, I see these photos where they're trying to set up this new camp with beautiful big white tents that have the United Nations Humanitarian Relief logo on them. And I'm thinking, oh, where did those tents come from all of a sudden? Why couldn't they have been given to the people who needed them 2 and 3 and 4 years ago already? But that was one of the issues, is that the United Nations and most of these camps in Greece have not been declared officially as refugee centers. They're just known as hotspots. And that's a big problem. If they were officially declared as refugee centers, then they would get all of this UN support that they haven't got. But the UN has gone along with this policy that the European Union is trying to maintain, that they act as the European Union, and nations don't do their own thing, although it's just not working with this. I really think that they need to come up with something different as far as Moria goes. And also deliberately, and this is so disturbing for me, and this will be my last comment, they have deliberately followed a course of, how should I describe it, of making the experience in these camps appear so awful as a deterrent, as a way of trying to deter people from coming. They have repressed, they have used a program of repression as a means of deterrence. And that's got to, I don't know, it's got to stop. Doctors Without Borders is outside the camp when we were there, and I imagine that they are still there. And they go into the worst places in the world, Doctors Without Borders. And they said at that time, they said, these are some of the worst conditions we have ever seen in a camp. And this is a camp on European soil. We're not talking about a war zone in, you know, in Africa or Syria or wherever. So yeah, that's just my little blurb about Moria. We need to speak up and say, and try to urge our politicians, urge our, yeah, to come up with a better solution, because this one certainly isn't acceptable.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for highlighting that. I'm with you on that, and I'm sure everybody else is too. There was one last question. What would be the best way to contact you if anybody wanted to be in touch with you?
Okay, I can make. How should I do that? Make my email address available?
And then post your email address into the chat. But I'm guessing that you're also on LinkedIn, where you can be found. And
that's right. That's correct.
And I'm guessing that's a way too. So with that, it would be time for us to finish this webinar, this iteration of the anti-racism learning series that we are embarking on in SIETAR. It's one of the things that the board of SIETAR Europa has committed to do. One is to educate ourselves and our membership, and other things that we're doing are revising our guidelines and see what and our procedures and processes to really put those under the microscope and see where we need to do better, to look at how we organize events, to see how we organize this organization so that it becomes a better organization that is more welcoming to more people. So thank you very much, Sue, for being a part of that journey, for holding up this critical mirror. And there was one comment that was made that in the chat just now, that there's probably going to be a lot of questions once all of this is digested. So with that,
okay.
We're all going to be moving on to digestion, and hope that this discomfort will bring us to a better place.
Yeah.
Thank you very much again, and thank you very much, everybody. And that's it.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.